welcome to the conversation on the boundaries of pluralism in synagogue life. And we're going to be discussing issues that arise in merged and merging congregations as a template for understanding pluralism in the American Jewish community. We have two speakers to share their experiences with us. The first is Linda Rich, who is a field consultant for the Alban Institute, a specialist in coaching leadership, organizational development, and management consulting. And she has worked with synagogues, nonprofit organizations, large corporations, and small businesses. Linda has provided lay leadership in a variety of settings, including a cross-denominational study on the role of the rabbi, which resulted in the popular guide, The Rabbi-Congregation Relationship, A Vision for the 21st Century. You can read the rest of her bio in your packet, but we're very lucky to have her expertise. She has worked with many congregations on these issues. We're also very fortunate to have with us Rabbi Steve Kushner, who has served as the spiritual leader of Temple Ner Tamid in Montclair, New Jersey, since its inception in 1980. And in that time, he has been instrumental in developing adult education, interfaith, social action, outreach, family programming, and even a klezmer band as integral elements of the synagogue. Rabbi Kushner, you can read the rest of Rabbi Kushner's bio in the packet, but he has been instrumental in presiding over the successful merger of two communities, and he's going to be sharing with us that experience. I'm going to hand the mic over in a moment to Linda Rich to begin to talk about the kinds of pluralism issues that arise when communities merge. And I want to invite us to listen with an ear not only to the interesting situations that can arise when communities with two different practices and perhaps sometimes with two different value systems, or more than two, begin to come together, but also for the process of how do we go about talking about those conflicts? How do we go about noticing where the edges are and where we might look for compromises, solutions, or other ways of dealing with multiple practices? And how do we understand that process as a positive and important part of bringing communities that have been separate together? So please be listening with those thoughts in mind, and after our speakers present for a little bit, we will open up for some discussion. So Linda, thank you.
So I want to start with a quote to read you a paragraph about what happened in the 1920s. In Philadelphia, after World War I, a group from Beth Israel congregation, where men and women worshiped together while an organ played, joined a group from Ohel Jacob congregation, where men and women were rigorously separated and no instrumental music accompanied the worship, to create Beth Shalom, an emerging conservative congregation. Rabbi Mortimer J. Cohen would later describe the 1920s as Beth Shalom battles: the battle of the location, the battle of the spittoons, the battle of the mixed seating, the battle of the mixed choir and organ, the battle of language of the service, all Hebrew or mixed Hebrew and English. That was in the 1920s. So this isn't as new as we sometimes think it is. The issues, obviously, that we're discussing today are somewhat different. We're not talking about whether to have spittoons or not. That was a very big issue back then. But today we are talking about which prayer book to use, how egalitarian the practice should be, who counts as a Jew, and very importantly, we're often talking about the memorial plaques, where we should hang them, where the ones from the other synagogue go, and things like some very practical issues that are not actually, religious. There's another level, though. There's a third level underneath that, and that's the level of narrative or stories, or actually the identity. It's how we construct meaning. It's what we tell ourselves and about others and about how the world works, how we internalize and integrate our experience to define who it is and who we are and who we want to be. And that's what we can change. That's what we reinvent every day as we go along in life. We write our own identities, we write our own stories. And some of the stories have to do also, something was not discussed with this morning, was what is our purpose in even sitting here? What's a story we tell each other about what religion is about what God means? Those kinds of stories, which I happen to think are interesting and fascinating and wonderful to have conversations about. In terms of merging and deciding how we are going to practice together and be together and live together, I think the place that's worth working with are those values, that middle place, the values and the common understanding of where do we share. And then the place to go from there is to say, okay, how can we practice together, if at all? And what are the stories underlying it that we tell ourselves and about each other that can be very interesting to each other? And do we want to continue to rewrite the stories that we're telling? So in terms of doing all that assessment and working with one or more other partners that we're looking at merging with, we want to be talking at that level of values. And we also want to identify anytime if there are deal breakers that are very, very important to us in terms of our practices in which we manifest our values. So for example, I worked with two congregations. One was Reform and one was Conservative. They are working towards a merger. Right now they're cohabiting. One is renting space from the other, but they're working towards a kind of merger. It's actually a multi-level merger. It's rather interesting. They will still have two congregations under a merged organization. And they each came to the table concerned about what the other would want to do, how the other would want to practice differently. The Conservative congregation had one deal breaker that they insisted on, which was the building must be kosher to our standards. The Reform congregation had one deal breaker. It's a very musical congregation. And they said, we must be allowed to have instrumental music, recorded music, any kind of music we want at our service. And they each said, okay, we will live to your primary concern, and they're moving ahead from there. They did decide, by the way, interestingly enough, that they needed time, that they weren't ready yet to go and merge. And that is one of the things that we find and that we suggest to people is to avoid premature closure. Don't finalize things before you're ready to finalize them. And lastly, you want to envision the new thing. And I am going to be very excited about working with Steve and merging our congregations and talking about how we can envision living our shared core values, because we discovered we have a lot of core values in common, and we're going to live them in fresh and exciting ways. We're talking about possibilities and the future, and we're using the language of possibility.
Good afternoon. So first, for me, I think it's important, my narcissism notwithstanding, to talk just a bit about myself so you know a little bit about how I got to this congregation. I am not related to Harold Kushner. I want to be clear about this. However, Larry and I are brothers. So we've got the family connections clear. More importantly, I want to just real briefly share with you about Larry's and my grandparents, because it's an important part of this whole discussion, I think. Our grandfather, of blessed memory, was, I think I could say, a classical Reform Jew of German parents who studied at the Hebrew Union College in the 1890s with Isaac Meyerwise, until he met our grandmother of blessed memory, who was a Presbyterian, direct descendant of John Alden and Priscilla Mullen of the Mayflower. That means that I've got real yichus, and you can determine on which side of the family tree that yichus is most meaningful. I get a lot of mileage out of being, a 14th generation American. But nonetheless, their marriage forced our grandfather to drop out of the Hebrew Union College, but his Jewish identity remaining very strong. And then with the death of their firstborn son, Lorraine, son, Lorraine. He was named after the Lorraine Hotel in Indianapolis, Indiana, where he was born. A year after his death, my grandmother converted to Judaism with Rabbi Leo M. Franklin of Temple Bethel in Detroit, who also was a classmate of my grandfather. Now fast forward to 1972, I am a first-year rabbinic student at the Hebrew Union College in Jerusalem. My first day in Jerusalem, where do you go? You go to the Kotel. And I'm with my friend from Detroit, Chicky Marks, and Chicky and I are there, and you know, this is the early 70s. We've got the long hair and the big beards. And along comes another big bearded guy wearing a black coat, and he says, "Are you Jewish?" And we nod, and he said, "Why are you here?" And that was our first mistake. We told him we were studying to be rabbis. And you know, in the early 70s, Hasidism was really ascendant. People were really wanting to learn more about Hasidism. Buber and Heschel and, you know, all the literature out there was really in a re-enchantment with Hasidic teachings. And so he said, "Would you like to meet a Rebbe?" And how can you say no? I mean, little did we know that the Rebbe was in Tel Aviv. And within a half an hour, we were on a bus to Tel Aviv. And we get to some yeshiva off of Dizengoff Street, and I'm the first one to go in. My interview lasted about 3 minutes, and once he found out about my parentage and the fact that my maternal grandmother was a Presbyterian by birth and converted by a Reform rabbi, I was already outside. Chicky got kicked out about 15 minutes later when he was screaming with the Orthodox rabbi about I don't know what, but knowing Chicky and probably knowing the Rebbe there, they had a difference of opinion as to what authentic Judaism was. And the next thing we know, we are on Dizengoff Street with absolutely no idea where we are. Fortunately, there was a wonderful young student at the yeshiva who came downstairs and realized that we were forlorn and lost and gave us a little bit of money and directions to the bus depot and how to get back to Yerushalayim. 6 months later, I came home for a winter break, and it was Friday night, and I went to my temple in downtown Detroit, Temple Bethel, and as I walked into the sanctuary, so proud, here is the rabbinic student coming home. The usher greeted me at the door, and he wished me Shabbat Shalom. And he says, "Perhaps you would be more comfortable with that yarmulke in your pocket instead of on your head." I'm not sure, because my memory is a little vague. It might have been my father who said that, because he was one of the ushers, but somebody definitely said it, and it was at that point that I kind of knew that I was in this place of tension that we've talked about earlier today, and that I felt a need to resolve that tension. I'm still working on it. Now, in 1980, I've been ordained 3 years earlier, and I've been serving in a congregation in Milwaukee as an assistant, and now I'm looking for a job. And one of the factors was wanting to be on the East Coast, where I thought a lot of really cool stuff was happening. And among the congregations open is this place that is a merger of a Reform and a conservative synagogue. And I'm thinking, it's perfect. It's exactly what I want. I know that in the back of my head that chances are highly likely I will be looking for another job in about 3 years. Not because it was Reform and conservative, but because rabbis, the first rabbi of a merger often ends up being the korban and, ends up getting all that blood let out. Fortunately for me, our cantor who was a student cantor at the time, was more strident than I. She got fired first, and so that saved my job. I really believe that. So this congregation, this merger of Reform Temple Menorah and Conservative Temple B'nai Zion in Bloomfield, 1980, I'm walking into the interview, And I meet one of the leaders of the congregation, whose name, Norman Coley. And so as I'm walking in, I say to him, so tell me, what is this place? Is it really Reform or is it conservative? You know, I mean, and I have to tell you that I got that question as the rabbi of this congregation for at least 15 years. People wanting to join the synagogue, what are you really? Are you Reform or are you conservative? And he looks at me with a straight face and he says, Rabbi, we're Jewish. That's it, we're Jewish. Now, it took us a few years to figure out what that meant. But the bottom line that I learned from them, and you know, my ideals and what I wanted to achieve as a rabbi of blending these two communities together and finding a Judaism that could work for the modern American Jewish world, it's what they taught me, not what I taught them. And that is that it was all about community. It had nothing to do with identification as Reform Jews or identification as conservative Jews or trying to create a new liberal Judaism that we could carry into the 21st century. They weren't thinking about any of those things. They were in a community where the Jewish population following the Newark riots of the late 1960s had been declining. They had a long and glorious heritage. Temple B'nai Zion's roots go back to the First World War in Bloomfield. Temple Menorah was founded in the baby boom years of the mid-1950s. They loved their community, and they saw their numbers dwindling, and they could have closed up shop and moved to other congregations a little bit further west, and probably been better served, but for them, maintaining the Jewish community of Bloomfield was first and foremost on their minds, and they were willing to sacrifice their ideological identities for the sake of community. It became my job to help them do that. And I remember when I first came in, and I was very clear, and I don't know that I would say this again today, I'm not sure, but I was very clear. I said, look, we cannot be all things to all people. We have to try to find a derech ha'emtza, a middle path, and try to serve the core of the community. And those who are on the margins, those who are the most traditional, and those who are the most liberal are probably not going to be happy here. And indeed, we lost them as members. But it was that core group that found a middle path between the traditions of conservative Judaism and between the progressiveness of Reform. We were able to find a liturgy that worked for us. We were able to find a level of practice that worked for us. And over time, it just developed. Now, having said that, I should share with you that, in my opinion, the really big issues had nothing to do with religion. It was all about one community, in this case, the conservative congregation, who had abandoned their building in Bloomfield Center, who had moved uptown into the northern section of Bloomfield, who had left their prayer book behind, who had left their rabbi behind. The Reformers, on the other hand, stayed in their building. Their rabbi stayed on for 3 more years as the emeritus. They were using the new Reform prayer book at the time, Gates of Prayer, but it was still a Reform prayer book. And the new rabbi coming in was a Reform rabbi. The new cantor coming in was a student at the Hebrew Union College. The interesting thing is that after a few years, what we discovered was that the people from the conservative shul were really, really happy with what they found, because the transition wasn't nearly as dramatic as they had anticipated it to be, whereas the Reformers, thinking it was going to be the same, were shocked that everything had changed. That is to say, there was more Hebrew than they were accustomed to. There were more traditional melodies in the liturgy than they were accustomed to. Their Reform rabbi wore a kippah. They weren't used to that. And all of a sudden, it was like we were dealing with a lot of angry Reform Jews. The conservative Jews were thrilled because they didn't realize that a Reform rabbi could be so traditional. The worst moment in the history came on the first High Holy Days, when the president got up to make announcements. Now, keep in mind that they had been getting stuff in the mail for weeks about the order of the services. But if you're from a traditional background, you know that you do Yizkor pretty early in the day. But in the Reform movement, and particularly in the Reform High Holiday Prayer Book, Gates of Repentance, the Yizkor service comes after the afternoon or Mincha liturgy. So we were just going to follow the order of the prayer book. So after the morning service, the president gets up to announce the order for services in the afternoon. Mincha will be at, I think in those days it was at 4 o'clock maybe, 3 or 4 o'clock. And then when he announced that Yizkor will be like at 4:30 or 5 o'clock, the only way I can describe it, remember nobody has been eating for a very long time, this mass wave of bad breath hit the bima. What? Because the conservative Jews, particularly the older folks, had been accustomed to saying Yizkor earlier in the day because when they were done with Yizkor, then they went out to lunch. They got through, not all of them, but they got through with doing what was for them the most religious thing, and that was, doing honor to their blessed loved ones. And so now when we had put Yizkor later in the afternoon, that totally messed up their day. This is how we resolved it. We flipped the order of Mincha and Yizkor. So now Yizkor comes at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and everybody was happy. Again, I could go on and talk a lot about how we made things happen, and I'm sure I will reflect on that. But suffice it to say, in my opinion, the issues that people had to struggle with, and I think as Linda has indicated here as well, had far more to do with their identities of how they thought of themselves, about their sense of connection to each other, than it did with anything per se in relation to this is the right way or this is the wrong way to do it. In the end, the success of the merger, and I think it's really been very successful, has been because we found a common ground that everybody could feel comfortable with, but that most importantly, we really worked hard to create community in all of the senses of what that meant.
Thank you both so much. Can you speak a little bit about how and whether this is a conversation about pluralism as opposed to simply necessity? And in what ways does pluralism inform, or your sense of pluralism inform these conversations? Because clearly when two or more groups of people get together and they have no choice but to live with one another, they have to find ways of working together. But in what ways does an ethic of pluralism sort of enhance or inform that conversation, or even inform the decision to merge?
So my feeling is that if congregations are going to approach this idea of merging across denominations, they've already accepted the idea that there are multiple, authentic, positive ways to be Jewish. So if that's what you call a pluralistic endeavor, then yes, it's a merging across denominations would certainly be a pluralistic endeavor.
When I first came to the synagogue, I was very insistent on having one service. At a student position in Battle Creek, Michigan, we had for the high holidays, there was like a traditional service, and then there was the more reform service. And it made me uncomfortable because people were, on the high holidays, they were davening in different places. I've come in a totally different, I'm in a totally different place today, and now I'm perfectly comfortable with multiple minions on a Shabbos morning. But the fact of the matter is, and we have different services going on the holidays as well. But what's interesting is that the services are not like traditional and liberal. It's more like the way we used to do it 20 years ago and the way we do it now. You know, I mean, it's still that middle road, but some people just like the way we used to, you know, sing Adon Olam or Matovu in the morning, and so.
If we're all Jews and we're all the same, why don't we join with the Orthodox congregation? And why don't we join with the, you know, we obviously the fact that we are in this space and not in some other space means we don't, there's no such thing as we're all the same, because otherwise we wouldn't have Jews and Christians. We'd just all be people. We'd all have one universal religion, or we'd all be universalists, or whatever it is. So I agree with you. There are people who don't want to go there to that level and don't want to have those conversations. And I, for myself, don't want to be in a community that doesn't want to have those conversations.
I think a lot of people really value their practices. I don't mean to be flippant with you. I think that their values are embodied in those practices. They can't separate them out. And so that on some level, if I were in that situation, I would have people sit down and talk about why it is they value those practices. As long as we could figure out a way for everybody to be together somewhere along the way. I mean, in fact, my cantor, many of you know Meredith Greenberg, and she and I have played a lot with notions like having multiple minions and then one big kiddush where everybody comes together. I mean, for me, the most important thing in the early days was fostering that sense of singular community. And I will say, lastly, that, and I don't know if it's a blessing or a curse, that as a result, our lay leadership never really totally bought into either the Reform or the conservative movements. So they never really got real active in either the Reform or the conservative movements. They kind of were nishtehin and nishteher, you know, they were marginalized. They just didn't feel that real strong sense of identity, and on some levels, I mourned that because I really wanted them to go to biennial conventions or annual, you know, meetings of the movements so that they could learn about leadership techniques. But on the other hand, it's also been a blessing because for us, again, it's not are we Reform or conservative, we're just Jewish. And so like AJR, we've in some ways become a post-denominational synagogue.
I'd like to thank both of our speakers, Rabbi Kushner and Ms. Rich, for their insights and for helping us with this conversation.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support Shalom TV with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double high or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the Shalom TV website homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to GEM. To GEM, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York, 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive on DVD with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.